Not clear what else is going on at this moment, but here it is.
I'll send you a text.
Please do.
My I tried to keep the same iPhone number, but couldn't. But my email hasn't changed at all.
No, I couldn't get through to you on that.
On email?
Yeah, it got hijacked.
There's a good story about it. I'll tell you.
Okay, I'll send you a okay, excellent.
My phone number is unchanged.
Good. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. We are really excited to welcome Dr. Martin for our second research seminar of the semester. I will be sending out a notification soon, but we have our third seminar coming up after the break, and we'll be having Professor Susanna Cornwall from Exeter come to talk to us about the church, structural sin and delinquent institutions. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Martin in a second. For those of you attending online, we have some of our distance students attending in online. We're going to, well, for all of us, we're going to have a paper for about 45 minutes. We'll give everyone a little break and then we'll come back afterwards for questions. So people on the Teams channel, you can type your questions and I'll kind of pass them on that way. Yeah, over to you. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much, Marika. Fortunately, I don't think I can be on this, or it'll just be my torso. So bye, people on the screen. Hi. So in 1869, the newly formed government of Canada aimed to secure its sovereignty over the vast country stretching from Lake Superior to the Rocky Mountains by encouraging agricultural settlers to move out west and claim a plot of land as their own. This plan required one of the most ambitious projects of modern geography, the Dominion Land Survey. However, when the surveyors reached the land of the Métis Nation, an indigenous group near what is now Winnipeg, a party led by Louis Riel met the surveyors and literally took a stand on the surveyors' chain, setting off what's called the Red River Resistance. It was no coincidence that the resistance started over a scientific project. Throughout the colonial period, modern science has played two important roles in imperialist projects. On the one hand, it has been a crucial tool of colonial governance. On the other hand, it has provided justification for colonization. Colonization was often justified on the grounds that it was bringing truth, first in the form of religion and later in the form of modern science to the ignorant natives. The story of the Red River Resistance is a story of resistance to a form of government, a way of life, and a kind of knowledge. It reveals the emptiness of the myth of the superiority of modern science to other ways of knowing the earth. Contrary to its own self-mythologizing, science is not more profound or exact than the knowledge it swept aside, just better suited to the bureaucratic demands of empire. Right. So less than 2 years after its confederation, Canada purchased Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company, called the Company. Even before the sale took effect, the Canadian government sent surveyors to map 200 million acres of the territory and divide it into plots ready for homesteaders to claim and farm. The Dominion Land Survey, or DLS, as I'm going to call it sometimes, and the Homestead Act empowered settlers to take ownership of 160-acre plots in exchange for a $10 fee and settlement duties such as maintaining residence, building a home, and cultivating part of the land. Today, the marks the DLS left on the country can be seen at a glance from 35,000 feet in the air. From the cruising altitude of an airliner, the prairie resembles a checkerboard, its geometrical exactness only disturbed by the faint contours of a river. Up until Canada bought the region, only the First Nations communities and Métis fur traders who lived there knew it in any detail. Earlier maps commissioned by the company identified major landmarks such as lakes and rivers, fur trading posts, and First Nations communities, but that still left much of the place terra incognita to anyone who didn't inhabit it. The DLS changed that. making it possible for politicians or Dominion Land Office administrators to pinpoint accurately the location of a parcel of land as small as 10 acres anywhere on the Dominion grid. The precision of the DLS was crucial to the project of the settlement of the Canadian West. Property was the only real inducement for settlers to make the arduous journey west from Ontario, and that depended on some system that could guarantee a property claim in advance to any prospective settler. The government had to establish common knowledge of each parcel of land, and more importantly, property rights over it between itself and the settler. The grid work of the DLS not only identified every spot in the region, it created new identities for it. What had only been a tiny portion of the blank space west of the Red River on earlier company maps, but which local communities may have known as their common woodlot, where they could shop what they needed, might now be designated as, for example, SW1/4-S.3/T.4R.1W3, for example, a 160-acre plot that some settler could claim. The DLS was a project of scientific discovery, and at the same time, one of political intervention. This dual purpose was perceived by the Métis community as soon as surveyors turned up on their land, and so the Red River Resistance of 1869 kicked off when Louis Riel and 17 other Métis stood on a surveyor's chain and told him to leave the country, claimed as the property of the French half-breeds, and which we would not allow to be surveyed by the Canadian government. The general preference for modern science and the deprecation of any other ways of knowing is not a consequence of the superiority of scientific knowledge across the board. It's due to the indispensability of modern science for the specific tasks of governing and exploiting colonies. One instance of the conflict between modern science and the forms of knowledge that it swept aside is the struggle over the DLS. The Métis were the descendants of First Nations women and French-Canadian fur traders that they married. Although Métis often hunted, traded, and socialized with the First Nations tribes they descended from, they built their communities apart and at arm's lengths from both the Hudson's Bay Company that they were not exactly employed by, but contracted to, and the tribes. They were zealously independent, as their songs such as The Buffalo Hunt by their national poet Pierre Falcon attest. It goes, "We are bois brûlés, free men of the plains. We choose our chief. We are no man's slave." Over the course of the 1800s, they developed a cultural and political identity, calling themselves La Nouvelle Nation, Bois Brûlés, Métis, or Michif, which was the word for the people and their language in Michif. Skip that one. From the 1810s, the semi-nomadic circuit of the Métis centered on the Red River. During the summers, families grew vegetables and sometimes grain there. However, this season was merely an interlude in a life spent hunting buffalo on the plains, fishing, and trading beaver pelts. They traveled by a mode of transportation they invented called the Red River cart, pulled by horses or oxen. When they moved, it was all together as a family alongside other families. The nomadic way of life was not only a necessity for the Métis, it was what they loved. According to Jean Tellett, the monotonous toil of the settlers had virtually no appeal. They lived, as George Simpson said, entirely by the chase. They liked the freedom of the plains, the wind in their faces, and the constant change that mobility brought. The ambitions of the Canadian government to settle the newly purchased Rupert's Land in 1869 came into conflict with the Métis' migratory and communal way of life, a conflict that mirrored those between central governments favoring private ownership and settled populations, and communities which shared land and moved around that were then happening all over the world. Another example would be the Enclosures Act in Britain. The Dominion Land Survey and the Homestead Act were the engines that brought government bureaucracy and eventually the army into the place where the Métis were masters of the plain, as they were called. Settlement was crucial to the Canadian government's plan to firm up their tenuous claim to a strategically important sovereignty over the Northwest. The Northwest was the key to Canada's ability to hold its own against the United States as a continental power. If Canada maintained sovereignty over the Northwest, it could realize its ambition to become a country that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. However, if it could not, the United States might be able to use the territory to make Alaska, which it had purchased from Russia in 1867, contiguous with the other states, cutting off eastern Canada from British Columbia in the west. The Canadian government feared encroachment from America, as well as the Republican spirit of the Métis. These were among the reasons that the agricultural settlement of the prairies was a priority for the government. But the government also had sectarian and racist reasons to import a settler colonial population to dilute Métis control in the area. For generations, English colonists had regarded Métis as half-breeds, whose very existence was indecent or unnatural. They were also regarded as politically suspect because of their Catholic and Francophone roots. They were, quote, too Indian, too Catholic, and too French. Nevertheless, it was the government's land use policy, not an explicitly racist or sectarian one, that broke the back of the Métis Nation. Canada's plan to develop agricultural settlement would require strict enforcement of property rights and boundaries. Homesteaders would be able to stake their claim to their 160 acres as their private property and expect the government to defend it against encroachment. Only a precise and standardized mapping project like the DLS would make it possible for the Dominion Lands Office, over 1,000 miles away in the capital, to keep track of which 160-acre plot had been claimed and which were still available, who owned and could be taxed for which property, and the boundaries between them. As a systematic study of the geography of the region, the DLS was an extraordinary scientific achievement, but that is not to say that it was an improvement upon the knowledge of the region that came before it. It was certainly an improvement on the maps that England and the company had commissioned previously. Before the DLS, these maps were the only way that a bureaucrat in London or Ottawa could understand the territory they governed. These maps were sufficient for the Hudson Bay Company to do its business in the area. They indicated the position of its trading outposts and major geographical features. But their relative positions were inexact, and it was not nearly detailed enough to record the ownership of individual homesteads. The DLS used some of the same technologies and the same approach to geographical knowledge as these earlier maps, but introduced a far greater degree of accuracy. Don't have page numbers, so I just need to make sure I'm not going to reread what I've just read already. Oh, there it is. That helps. On the other hand, for those who actually inhabited the Northwest, the DLS came nowhere near the depth and accuracy of their own knowledge of the region. The Métis and First Nations who lived there knew all the important factors that, for example, Aaron Arrowsmith's map of British North America laid out in 1844, such as the location of rivers and forts. I couldn't find the 1844 one, so it's a slightly earlier one. But they also knew where the good fish runs were in June, where beavers could be trapped in the fall, and most importantly, the migration patterns of the buffalo. However, the DLS did some things that the indigenous geographical knowledge could not. For one thing, although the semi-nomadic ways of life and extensive communities of the Métis meant that their knowledge of the Northwest was extensive, the consistent methodology of the DLS allowed it to maintain roughly the same degree of precision across the entire country. For another thing, by using the standardized geographic coordinate system, which you can actually see here as well, the latitude and longitude lines, it put it in a form that could be communicated at a great distance. The coordinate system establishes points of reference with global legibility. That is, someone who understands how to use the system can locate the first meridian of the DLS at longitude 97 degrees, 27 minutes, 28.4 seconds, I think is how to read that over here, regardless of whether they have any familiarity with the surroundings. The points of reference used by Métis and First Nations people to convey information to each other were of a kind that could only be understood by those who already had some familiarity with the area. For example, an 1801 map drawn by company cartographer Peter Fiddler on the basis of descriptions from a First Nations man named Akomokki gives the location of rivers flowing from the Rocky Mountains here. So that's like from west flowing east and south. Gives the location of rivers flowing from the Rocky Mountains, along with the number of days a journey between them would take. The information would be almost meaningless to anyone who did not already know the area well enough to identify which river they happened upon. However, for those who did, Akomokki's chart of travel time to the next river might not only be far more useful, but provide far better knowledge than maps using modern cartographic methods. That's for one thing, because these maps, these new maps, only indicate the distance between landmarks. They don't tell us anything about the lay of the land or terrain, factors that have just as large an effect on what mattered most for the users of these earlier maps, which is time of travel. The benefits of many modern scientific innovations are of this type. Their essential function is in vastly expanding the scale of what we can know. Without science's techniques for collecting information in a standardized way over long periods of time and vast distances by many different people, we could never know things like the average age of a whole country's population or the number of chickens on the planet. However, because of the utility of this kind of standardized, large-scale knowledge for the needs of centralized bureaucracies of modern imperial states, and because of more illustrious achievements of science, such as the discovery of the laws of physics and the technological innovations that they've made possible, scientific knowledge has become the sole legitimate basis for any and all claims. For the most part, in order for a claim about the world to be acceptable in the public sphere, it must have some kind of basis in science. It's broadly assumed that modern science cuts through the subjective character of individual experience, allowing us to discover objective truths about the world, therefore getting us closer to how things really are, not just how we perceive them. This is rarely, if ever, the case. While the sciences help us overcome some of the variability in individual perception, they also smuggle in biases that are inherent in their methods. For example, the use of QALYs, or quality-adjusted life years, in measuring the impact of public health interventions can overcome the arbitrariness of an individual's judgment as to whether it is beneficial and worth doing. This allows funders to decide whether the intervention is cost-effective. However, the decision near universal among global health aid groups and NGOs to use QALYs or similar metrics to assess initiatives smuggles in its own biases, that health is measurable, that we should be looking at the health of the individual whose years are being counted, rather than something like the community or the family, and that the lives of the young are more valuable than the old. While there are many kinds of facts that we can only find out through science, the dismissal of other ways of knowing the world as merely subjective or anecdotal conceals just as many. For example, demographics and economic statistics are the only way to know many things about London, but they won't help you understand if Homerton, my neighborhood, is thriving, whether the people there are safe, how cohesive the community is, or whether tensions between groups have been alleviated. It can only give you sort of proxies for these bigger questions. Someone who spends a lot of time living, working, or volunteering or hanging out in the neighborhood, though, can find out answers to these questions. Their claims will be partial and open to dispute, just as scientific claims are. But if they're based on the person's experience and what others have told them, they're nevertheless grounded in reality. To make a country comprehensible to bureaucrats in an office in the capital requires different techniques than on-the-ground navigation. Think about it this way. If I'm giving you directions to my house and you're already familiar with Homerton, it might be enough for me to refer to local landmarks to guide you there. I can say, for instance, go straight until you see Taylor Street Coffee, turn right for 4 blocks, then left until you get to the corner shop with a red sign. Because I can assume that you have a first-hand familiarity with concrete reference points in the surroundings, it's not necessary to standardize our points of reference in advance. Without precise measurements or standardized points of reference, such as the geographic coordinate system, go back, I can still help you navigate the area effectively enough. However, that will be of little use if I want to explain where I can be found to a tax collector who has never visited and never will visit my neighborhood. The administration of empires required the developments of ways of knowing their territory, and therefore the invention of technologies such as geographic and demographic surveys. They would need to be able to make the geography comprehensible to someone who does not already have the kind of knowledge that makes it possible to pick out reference as they go along, as with my directions to my house or Akomoki's map. What people find it meaningful to know about their world depends on their way of life. For me, an East London hipster, knowing the place I live means knowing the names of the streets and which stores carry the good hummus and which ones charge too much for kale. For the Métis, it meant knowing things like whether they were grazing their ox on common land, which river led to the trading post, and the migration patterns of the buffalo. It's a reflection of the chauvinism of modernism that we tend to consider non-scientific ways of knowing as practically oriented in this sense, connected to and deriving their meaning from a way of life, while denying the fact that scientific knowledge is just as much dictated by how we live. Modern science and the modern scientific culture around it has allowed itself to be persuaded by the myth that it is pure, objective, disinterested, whereas other forms of knowledge are skewed by the culture they arise in. In fact, modern scientific knowledge is no less dictated by the ways of life of the people who gathered and funded it. The example of the DLS is meant to show us how the colonial political order demanded different, but not necessarily better kinds of knowledge than that of the Métis inhabitants. For the Canadian government, knowing the earth meant making a permanent record of where a given plot of land is. It was in its suitability for this way of knowing the land that the DLS was superior, not in general. The notion that scientific knowledge is free of determination by a particular way of life, and therefore neutral and objective, ignores the way that it is shaped by practical, social, and political considerations of its own.
That's really sweet of you, my dear. That's absolutely lovely of you.
It was for the purpose of centralized administration that geography was first invented in Pharaonic Egypt. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus described the use to which geometry was put by the Egyptian tax surveyors. King Sesostris divided the country among all the Egyptians by giving each an equal square parcel of land, and made this his source of revenue, appointing the payment of a yearly tax. And any man who was robbed by the river of a part of his land would come to Sesostris and declare what had befallen him. Then the king would send men to look into it and measure the space by which the land was diminished, so that thereafter it should pay in proportion to the tax originally proposed. Here's a fresco from the tomb chapel of Nabaman, which you can see at the British Museum, depicting some tax surveying going on right there. In the floodplains of the Nile, geometry was a material practice involving the laying out of ropes on the land by rope stretchers. The Greek term hypotenusa comes from which we derive hypotenuse, literally means stretching under, this practice of using ropes to measure the land. They did this to survey changes in the field following the year's flood, all for the purpose of taxation. Geometry is an extraordinary invention of human culture that has made countless advances in knowledge possible. What is it about geometry that's so special, and that has made not just the acquisition of knowledge, but a number of further scientific revolutions possible? Well, geometry's secret is in its simplification and abstraction. As the phenomenologist Edmund Husserl explained, the key to geometry's success is that it ignores all of the qualities of a line except for a single one, its length. There would have been infinite ways for Sesostris' subject to describe the land that they farmed, many of them relevant to both the work of farming and how highly it could be taxed. They might have described it in terms of whether it has good drainage, the richness of its soil, or how free it is from rocks and impediments to tilling. The king's tax assessment, however, required a simplified way of describing the land, a single number to denote its area. Of course, the administrative constraint of having to use a single number to describe land ended up being the key to geometry's ability to describe and compare any parcels of land, and not just parcels of land, any physically extended objects, or even imaginary shapes and the form of space itself. The genius of geometry consists in abstracting away from all characteristics of space so that only the pure point, the line segment, and the plane count. Not only lines across the land, every perceivable line, from a geometer's line on paper to a surveyor's chain across the prairie, has a color and texture and other sensible qualities that make it visible to our eyes. But in order to make it exact and capable of being communicated unambiguously, it's necessary to ignore all characteristics except for that one of length. The length of the line is abstracted from every other characteristic, and that means that a measurement of the length of a line is posited as, rather than discovered to be, a completely adequate description of it. And only a more precise measurement can surpass it. So it would make no sense to say to the geometer, sure, your line is 1 meter long, but you have forgotten to mention that it's also brown. Nor would it make sense to ask the surveyor, you have told us that the Lake District National Park covers 2,362 square kilometers, but you did not tell us if the daffodils flutter and dance in the breeze, as Wordsworth tells us. Geometry operates under this basic assumed rule that nothing counts except for the spatial characteristics. So as a tool, this approach is marvelously powerful. The problem starts, as Edmund Husserl explains, when we begin to take the number indicated by the stretched rope or surveyor's chain or any other instrument as what's really there, or at least as closer to what's really there than what we learn from our naked eyes and expert wisdom and understanding of the land. Husserl referred to this as the surreptitious substitution of idealized nature, mathematical nature, for pre-scientifically intuited nature, in which experience, by which alone we perceive the world and find out what's there, is thought to be superseded by the idealized descriptions of the world in mathematical terms. This surreptitious substitution has been made by zealous champions of science from Galileo on. Science is supposed to improve on experience by allowing us to eliminate the part of our observations which are subjective in the sense that they are due to the perceptual systems, psychological makeup, or cultural background of the observer, and allow us to get at a purely objective account of things. Bernard Williams calls the ideal of pure objectivity the absolute conception. Thomas Nagel calls it the view from nowhere. I think I've lost which slide I'm on. There we go. No. Yeah, that is the right one. Sorry. This dream of a view from nowhere is what Galileo describes when he writes that the universe stands continually open to our gaze, but the book cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it is composed. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth.
Yes.
The idea of pure objectivity is that precise measurement and other techniques allow us to overcome our subjective experience of the world and get to know it as it is in itself. Husserl calls this a surreptitious substitution because in it we forget that measurements are only ever measurements of what we can observe. In a roundabout way, perhaps, but ultimately. And that ultimately, the only thing we can ever test our measurements against is our own experience. Husserl's criticism of science's pretense to get beyond the world of experience is that it's epistemologically irresponsible. There's no way to test the claim that geometrical measurement is more exact than human perception. It's just an assumption that must be made from the start. But these examples of its use by imperialists to invalidate other ways of knowing show a very real damage of this worldview. This, in part, is what Donna Haraway aims at when she mocks the notion of a view from nowhere as what she calls the God trick. She says, but of course, that view of infinite vision is an illusion, a God trick. The dangerous lie underlying the view from nowhere is that it is purely objective, neutral, unbiased. Haraway writes, the eyes have been used to signify a perverse capacity, honed to perfection in the history of science tied to militarism, capitalism, colonialism, and male supremacy, to distance the knowing subject from everybody and everything in the interests of unfettered power. The instruments of visualization in multinationalist, postmodernist culture have compounded these meanings of disembodiment. The visualizing technologies are without apparent limit. The eye of an ordinary primate, like us, can be endlessly enhanced by sonography systems, magnetic resonance imaging, artificial intelligence-linked graphic manipulation systems, scanning electron microscopes, computed tomography scanners, color enhancement techniques, satellite surveillance systems, home and office video display terminals, cameras for every purpose, from filming the mucous membranes lining the gut cavity of a marine worm living in the vent gases on a fault between continental plates, to mapping a planetary hemisphere elsewhere in the solar system. Vision in this technological feast becomes unregulated gluttony. All seems not just mythically about the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere, but to have put the myth into ordinary practice, sorry. And like the God trick, this eye fucks the world to make techno monsters. The descriptions that Williams and Nagel praise for getting us closer to reality are not closer to reality, they merely offer us a particular perspective. But then so does every source of knowledge. That's not the problem. There's nothing wrong with that in itself. And science is an extraordinarily rich source. The problem isn't that they're limited to a particular perspective, it's that they claim for themselves the view from nowhere. This self-deception, the God trick, the surreptitious substitution is the problem. Haraway again writes, here is the promise of objectivity, knowledge from the point of view of the unmarked, that is, the point of view that denies that it has a point of view. It's truly fantastic, distorted, and irrational. The only position from which objectivity could not possibly be practiced and honored is the standpoint of the master, the man, the one God, whose eye produces, appropriates, and orders all difference. Feminist standpoint epistemologists like Donna Haraway advocate abandoning the aim of perspective neutrality because it is impossible to attain. Therefore, any pretense to pure objectivity is only a concealment of the perspective that they smuggle in. The true meaning of objectivity, according to Haraway, is not to pretend to overcome subjective experience, but to indicate and take responsibility for the position of observation. Another way the biases of the DLS and other great mapping projects reveal themselves is through the political and social realities they codify or create on the one hand, and those they ignore and disrupt on the other hand. Because the aim of the DLS was to divide the region into plots for settlement, it carefully recorded some existing political boundaries, such as the boundary with the United States, and created others, such as the potential property lines of future settlers. At the same time, it ignored political realities that it considered inconvenient, such as Métis farms and the commons and the Métis nation itself. Disrupting common land use and enforcing private ownership and rights was a feature of many of the mapping projects of the modern age, and it was no different in early Canada. For one thing, the Homestead Act had no provision for shared ownership, whereas Métis communities maintained commons for growing hay and harvesting wood alongside their own individual farms, the 160-acre plot a family settled was their only resource, and they had sole rights over it. The survey left nothing aside as common land. For another thing, the migratory way of life of the Métis meant that they did not inhabit their farms year-round, and therefore did not meet the Homestead Act's definition of a settler. That meant that their claims were not recognized under the Act. Most importantly, the Act ignored the fact that in July of that year, the Métis had claimed an area centered around a 62-mile stretch of the Red River from Fort Garry, now the major city of Winnipeg, down to the US border for their nation. This claim was denied by the DLS. On October 11th, 1869, a Métis group led by Louis Riel confronted a survey team, informing them that they would not allow Métis land to be surveyed. It's an installation commemorating that day. A member of Riel's group, Janvier Richaud, stood on the surveyor's chain and was joined by his compatriots. It's significant that the first clash of the Red River resistance was against a scientific project. The Métis knew that the land over which they claimed sovereignty had been sold to Canada, and they knew that the survey was not meant to gather knowledge simply for the sake of knowledge, but that it was meant, through the exercise of mapping, to create new political realities which would pose a threat to their own. They recognized that their position would be weakened if they allowed Canada to use the survey to reorganize the land through its combination of knowledge and an imposition of political order. Therefore, standing on the survey chain was an important symbolic act as well as a demonstration of the Métis Nation's power. It rejected the survey and refused to cede important political ground in their resistance against a colonial incursion. The scientific endeavor of charting the Northwest cannot be disentangled from the political one of asserting Canadian sovereignty over it. But that does not make it any less scientific. The Dominion Land Survey is an extraordinary achievement, a paradigmatic example of the triumphs of modern science, still in use today. Because of the DLS, every acre of the Northwest could be identified with respect to its authorized usage and ownership, and still can. Of course, it's also a political and creative project. It identifies where entities are in the world, but for the most part, the entities it locates are the ones it creates. The Red River resistance was ended on 24th of August, 1870, when the Canadian Army arrived at Fort Garry. Whether at the barrel of a gun, through coercion or persuasion, modern scientific projects have come to dominate knowledge itself. On the flip side, folk knowledge, conventional wisdom, indigenous traditions, anecdotes, and first-person testimony have been discredited. What's the cost of this? No doubt, a lot of conventional wisdom is wrong, and first-person testimony certainly isn't always reliable. Are we not better off putting claims to the test of science? Well, I'd argue that not on the whole. Let's put aside the discovery of natural laws, such as Galileo's discovery that an object's mass has no effect on its rate of acceleration. Such discoveries are the preeminent accomplishments of science. They're largely responsible for its prestige. However, they're not where science comes into contact with our lives for the most part. Science impacts our lives in two chief areas, through medicine and through technocratic government. The phenomena and forces described by the sciences of medicine and government act with a lot less regularity than, say, gravity. Therefore, these sciences don't offer laws of nature, such as Newton's first law. But even though they don't explain anything with law-like regularity, they still have a lot to offer. Scientific knowledge brings great advantages in a couple of specific aspects. One we have discussed extensively already. By standardizing techniques of measurement, it makes it possible for us to cast our eyes wider than we could before. It's only because of this standardization that we can precisely collect measurements from many people in different places over a long period of time, allowing us to bring into view things like the average BMI or body mass index of an entire population. Maybe that's not a great example. It's kind of a worthless measurement, but never mind. I'll find a better one someday. This same standardization of measurement in conjunction with controls, with This same standardization of measurement, in conjunction with controls, allows us to determine whether a given cause reliably correlates with a given effect. This is especially useful in medicine. Comparing a treatment group with a control group makes it possible for us to test remedies, something that's impossible to determine otherwise. Determining cause and effect relations is difficult, perhaps impossible, for all kinds of reasons, especially in cases where the effect doesn't follow from the cause with anything like law-like regularity, but only follows from it some of the time or most of the time. This is the case with medicine, as well as poverty alleviation or any other social interventions. Okay, I'll give you an example to make that a bit clearer. Suppose you have a fever, take a pill, and the fever breaks. Maybe the pill alleviated your fever, but there are good reasons to think it might be something else. The placebo effect is real, for example. So is regression toward the mean, which in this case would describe the tendency to get better regardless of intervention. Think of it this way. If you're not feeling well, and you usually feel well, then chances are that you'll return to the state of feeling well, regardless of what you do or do not take. It's likely enough that an effect has other causes, that controlled trials offer an entirely different level of confidence in the impact of things than we can achieve without them. What I'm primarily concerned with, though, isn't the narrow question of whether science allows us to know the world better than other forms of knowledge. It's the broader question of whether science is good for us. Science, and in particular, the regime of scientism, the epistemological regime, which confers legitimacy on scientific knowledge alone and dismisses other kinds of claims as unfit to be taken seriously in public life, deprives us, and not just those of us who are the victims of colonial regimes, of a great deal of autonomy. Everywhere, technocratic regimes interfere with our work, demeaning our expertise by delegitimating our exercise of our own judgment and requiring metrics and KPIs to support our choices. Daniel Markovits, author of The Meritocracy Trap, describes how a couple generations ago, a branch manager at a bank would have been able to decide whether to grant a loan, whereas now they can only enter information along parameters set at the head office by teams of underwriters. Certainly, this standardized process eliminates some individual bias. I'm sure it wouldn't be hard to support my hunch that branch managers of yore were not the most diverse bunch, and that they tended to more readily grant loans to people who looked and talked like they did. But while standardization eliminates some of the bias of the individual, it only reinforces biases of the system. In this case, by limiting the manager's judgment, the decision to grant a loan is made more straightforwardly a question of wealth. It's possible that this quite cruel measurement was in many cases softened by managers that also took into account likability, physical beauty, height, etc., or maybe even need. Even though, no doubt, it was also often hardened by those same considerations. Regardless of whether the decisions arrived at by branch managers were better, more fiscally prudent, or more fair, what is certain is that as more and more of our work gets predetermined according to scientific, or at least supposedly scientific, formulas, we lose our autonomy. Throughout the world of professionals, decisions that would once have been left up to workers to make, well enough equipped as they were to do so on the basis of their experience and expertise, are now determined in advance by standardized formulas. This affects nonprofit funders, whose assessments are increasingly based on impact measurement. University hiring panels, which cannot ignore the scores of their applicants on the universally reviled research excellence framework. Fulfillment center workers, whose every movement is timed against a preset target, and so on. Freedom from the tyranny of modern science doesn't mean rejecting it, of course. There's so much we can learn by using scientific methods, and many of our choices can be improved by applying that knowledge and scientific technologies. But we should be more attentive to the limits of what standardized measurement and other scientific techniques can faithfully represent, and we should pay more attention to ways of knowing that it can't. Above all, We should be aware that when we go beyond being informed by large-scale projects of knowledge and standardization, and let them dictate the way we live and work, that we are giving up freedom. Thanks.
So much. We're going to take a 10-minute break. So we'll come back at 2 minutes to 6. So get some fresh air, go to the loo, and have a chat with people you're sitting with about what questions you would like to ask when we return for questions at 10 to 6.
It's well, how much you put for a drink? Really?
Yeah. That's just our pretty story.
The only sense is not exclusive.
Say for something science, it's a serious, it's
This is the ultimate problem, is they gave us far too reasonably moderate sort of things. We went like around and say, well, let's learn that in science. No, I think it's one thing that I guess that the weakness. I mean, the thing I did to me that was
what sense of possibility?
They started using technology for increasing the sales and what actually for us is literally is it AI actually creating its own? Punching people like where background is yeah, function. Where did you find it? So that is the and I think you do yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where that's going to be. It's definitely in my
You can go on to my ever growing database things. That's still not around. I'm here.
that's not the type of things. You're not going to get this with the search and watch them first.
We're going to make up. So I might check it out there.
Essentially, we have our stage. I'm going to make up
You must be university.
We'll make sure I do not keep any quotes. It's just this I mean, yeah, we talked about all three of those things.
Let's not recirculate the GIMP suits. You didn't mention it once today, so it's like, surely this is in the past.
I was trying to be nice. Last time we talked about
No, I genuinely haven't seen that guy in ages, so it's like, oh, I say, honestly. I did realise you might have seen that.
I wasn't crying, my eyes were sweating. What is one too many tips to breakfast this time? If I get it that night, you just regret them off. Back to the cows, it's much better.
We don't get everyone forward.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking for a price intelligence.
I was genuinely going to do clever working today. Yeah, and I just think like, but weird thing like addictive to work. You need to do some, otherwise you'll feel bad. But I did about an hour and then when I had a comment on that. Do birthday things. Actually, mostly like, nice knowledge generally.
There's an awful lot of people involved. The dominant people are moving like force. Mostly the most by real life. When we work with them, I think in lines. The line definition.
It's completely surprisingly okay. It's a weird thing of like, there's another bit missing. It's a bit weird moment. It's quite strange, like, coming across this like standard right consistently. Why you can what basically it's below me, and I'm like, oh, that's helpful. He's right.
Economics trying to find like, you know.
Yeah, that's been interesting. Just to look at it. I understand like it's a decent budget there. Because
It changed quite a bit in the beginning.
Do you understand this? But now with like a lot of
Yeah, some feedback. It's a chain on that.
Yeah, real cheap.
It's a real chain.
It's a weird one. Prove things going. That makes sense. Particularly I found with the decent original they don't necessarily directly answer the questions I want. They could say questions. So kind of like that one thing. I'm like, give me the answer I want. So that's kind of weird there. Like,
If games are presented in such a way that
I should probably start writing things about what I think you know. I get steering circles around me when it was like, I think don't actually see. I can always go, here's a limitation there, I'll go back.
most examples you raise is this kind of situation.
But, yeah,
That's just grand
it's a nice thing to play. Yeah, it's too like reading, sensibly on like a particular thing I need to do.
Feels like business analysis and
Like something where it's like I'm just enjoying changing pages for the market and stuff. Like this is still doing what first bit, but we're straight after the six as well. So it's you know, I don't know.
Once something so mean about grids, I mean.
Worry about everything and the implications of what it's read. So that's been quite
As soon as you see grids, like hotels, you can see it's all of the roads out. You know, H's and P's, like, you know, oh, the H, like, really, and it's like it's a proper. It's in the great points. The London exploration. Yeah, London has no grids.
Yeah, like it's
Blocks. That's the thing I'm talking about blocks in London. Or blocks. Politics have blocks.
It feels so
Roads, like, yeah.
so like
Blocks, because they're not
everyone
blocks.
else is using these words and I don't understand the word they're saying. It's kind of like it's a but now I do.
I mean, it's charming, like, they're not regular, it means nothing, like, 5 blocks in London, could be 10 miles.
You're very well making you feel like there's a joke and it's on you. It's like,
But
you know,
it's still
like, you
has
can
to
shoot
find a way.
where they're just clearly
If you say the street,
like, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Bus
Junctions, yeah, anything like that, yeah.
Like, an interview that they
Do
do.
criticism.
No. Rationality in Iraq.
In Python.
You know, every rational like system is founded on Iraq. Like communism is really like theology where there's actually why did you that these things are
That's good. No, that's exactly only the
ways
case.
like other ways of seeing things. That's about and then he talks about the stock market and something like, oh, you know, the stock market's disrupting making it, I mean, understand it, but look at it, it's delirium, it's nuts. And I'm kind of like, that's a joke.
So good.
Right, let's get going again. I realised that I did not take a moment to invite you to give a little bit of an applause for what was a really fascinating and stimulating paper. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have about half an hour for questions. I'm going to keep an eye on the Teams chat in case we have anyone who wants to ask questions there, but who has a question?
One of the things I want to challenge in your thing is you actually use the example of like the bank manager who now uses technology to like eliminate the biases of bank managers. You know, if you have a racist bank manager, they're not going to be giving loans to certain races. But I think just to a vision of like how ingrained we are in like science and doing better is the fact that in the Council of Capital, Jackie Wang actually talks about how when a county American Wicklow started using technology to process prisoners' sentences so that you can get like racist judges, racist polices, the system actually just created new proxies that would stand in place of race that would figure out, well, this is areas that are predominantly this ethnic group, and it would send them higher just because the evidence it's trained on was the historic racial evidence. I guess you know, when our history is built on racism, like how far can you actually realistically get to eliminating racism from science in any capacity?
Yeah, I definitely, I think that's a real challenge, especially since like it has not just sort of like, not just roots in racial bias, but also in very sort of Eurocentric and modern centric and anti-indigenous kind of ways of proceeding that that have the effect of sweeping away indigenous traditions and as well. So like on the one hand, I think science, I think I talk about how science itself creates a problem there, but I think your provocation was a bit more sort of like we should take really seriously the ability of measurements and of sort of like of standardizing these kind of things to overcome really deeply ingrained individual biases, and that's kind of where I yeah. And I think like it's kind of a utopian vision that I'm pushing to be in. And it should be one that like it would have to take that problem really seriously and not just go, oh, we were better off when branch managers, and that's kind of what the meritocracy trap guy does in a way. And I think that's naive because we do need to try harder to overcome those very real problems. And so much of like impact measurement in nonprofits, DEI frameworks, those sort of things are about that, and they're really important. I do think it's a problem when they're implemented in this kind of this kind of thoughtless way that isn't critical of their own structures. So I guess what I'm sort of suggesting is yes, let's do that science of looking at what the differences in incarceration rates are, for example. That's crucial. And then we need to use our judgment on top of that and not just stop with those numbers, but also collect all kinds of other information around it. How to do that? I don't have a simple answer for it because it's not a simple task, I guess. It's just going to be ongoing and iterative. Is that, I mean, feel free to come back if that's.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry, just before we go on, what was the name of the book and author that you?
It was Classroom Capitalism by Jackie Wang. I can send you a link.
Please do, yeah, I've heard of it before, but I. So,
I can send you a link.
oh, yes. I love it. Yes. Very good.
You mentioned with medicine and technocratic governance as examples of scientific knowledge that were not sort of as stringently law-based as, say, Newton's 3 laws and things like that. I wasn't entirely clear though on whether you were saying that this was a drawback or something that medicine, for example, can overcome controls. Would you be able to clarify some of that?
This is something that I'm glad that you're talking about this, because this is a part of the paper that I'd be really interested if anybody knows of any philosophies of science that can speak to this distinction that I'm kind of just making off the top of my head. Right? But I feel like there's a difference between well, okay, maybe I might be speaking past your question. Let me make sure I address that first. So no, I do think it's quite different. What we discover when we discover, you know, Newton's first law or something, that's a law, like that's always going to act that way. Those kind of discoveries of modern science, or like that the Earth revolves around the sun, these kind of things are very different from where science is happening for the most part, which is all statistical knowledge, which is all about probabilities. And it's not so much like the reason I'm drawing that distinction isn't to sort of like say, well, those aren't the hard sciences. And these other ones are. It's sort of that the prestige and sort of like the invulnerability to attack of those great achievements of the science, the Newtonian ones, for example, those have been really powerful in spreading the gospel of science, and we forget that the other sciences don't operate the same way. And that's, but again, that's not to say that we should like just attack them on that basis. They're not soft in the sense that it's super useful for us to have that kind of ability to understand what whether property rate or poverty rates are going up or not. But it's very different. Yeah. And it operates through proxies. Like, what are we trying to look at when we talk about poverty rates? So we're talking about something a little bit different than like the economic fact that we're counting there. We're talking about something like well-being, and I think it's important to remember that it's a proxy. I don't know if I completely answered.
I think that sort of answers my question, because I was having a bit of trouble with like whether because you were talking about how medicine had those sort of like, you know, for example, a fever could subside based on treatment of placebo or brushing course and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I was kind of going, oh, well, is that a limitation or a bent or something that can be removed via like control studies and things like that? And I think from what you answered, it sounds like I misunderstood a little bit what you were trying to say, because, you know, it sounds like you're trying to, correct me if I'm wrong, but make a distinction between sort of very clear causal knowledge and probabilistic knowledge, and that I was getting mixed up, sort of maybe.
Yeah.
To understand, you're trying to make that distinction and not something else. Am I?
Yeah, but you got me wondering why I'm making that distinction. So I might have to come back to you on that. But yeah, I am.
I don't know if this will help, but the impression I got when you first started making that distinction clearly was that it was to do with or science spreads its gospel through causal knowledge, but actually there's a whole bunch of other kinds of knowledge that are built on that are very different and not necessarily as
Complete. So
complete.
complete maybe is the,
Yeah.
is the word. Yeah, like that's the controlled trial of whether it's an anti-poverty intervention or Tylenol, paracetamol. That's going to tell us something. It is not going to tell us everything about it. The same way that like the yeah, I mean, it's all good, for example. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. Yeah.
Nice kind of metaphors or analogies or chances underneath this is you have this two French and two Catholic group literally saying no to a survey, like putting their foot on the chain about some kind of knowledge that has been gathered by an English group, like English origin group. And that seems to relate quite neatly to the big differences between England and France, which is that we have, this is almost prior to anything like science, this is a kind of a precondition for science. We have a survey. And everyone in the UK has to do the survey. And it's the law that you do the survey every X years. And that survey is then able to be used for various kinds of science, because then once you've got the survey, you can say, look, you know, this Homerton is full of people of this particular ethnic group, and this is why there's, you know, all of these things can be worked out and tracked. And of course, the French famously, you know, refused to have certain kinds of data gathered in the first place that could then be the basis of either oppressive or progressive scientific interventions. So no one knows how many Black people there are in France, because it is not allowed to be asked as a question. There is no permission of this as a precondition for then doing some kind of scientific study about, you know, is this area, and so this was a big problem for some because you weren't doing.
You're not Black, you're French. That's
yeah, absolutely. And it meant that then you couldn't say within France is COVID disproportionately affecting Black groups in particular neighborhoods, because they're not Black, they're French. So there was sort of a block on certain types of information. And this seems in a sense like it's not merely a refusal of science, it's kind of a refusal of data gathering that could then be used for scientific purposes that might be progressive or regressive. And I think it's quite an interesting thing that it's almost a notion of the holy, that within French society, there is a certain thing that, even though it could be used for good or bad ends, you're not even allowed to ask. Whereas I think within English society, you might say, any information, whether it can be used for good or bad, because it could potentially be used for good, must be gathered. All data must be gathered because it could be used for good. Even if in reality it's going to be used for bad, it doesn't matter. It could be used for good. We need to know who is where and what they're doing and mapping them in this precise surveying way. And that's, like I said, it's a precondition for then engaging in various kinds of social analysis of how did, you know, could be progressive. How did COVID impact on the different communities? How are jail sentences or police actions being disproportionately affected on particular neighborhoods and communities that have particular ethnic backgrounds or religious backgrounds, etc. So I guess this is just an opportunity to not simply talk about particular interventions, but talk about whether what comes out of, where do you stand on this idea that there are certain kinds of question that could be used for good or ill that should never be asked because of something akin to the sacred that seems to distinguish the Catholic French view that there are some things you can't ask because they're sacred, and the English view, everything must be asked because it's sacred. We must maximize all profit. We are like John Locke. We have a duty to convert all soil to maximum usage, and that's our divine mission. Whereas the French, we have a duty to avoid certain things because that would be against God's will. So there's there's interesting Protestant, Catholic, French, English stuff going on in the background here.
There is kind of, yeah, it's kind of like information is fully like to get as much of it as possible as like, and it's almost I kind of recoil at the idea that we wouldn't do that. I was laughing because my mom has this story that she loves to tell about. She used to teach in a Jewish Orthodox preschool, and they weren't allowed to count the children. This is a bit of an issue for preschool, where it's quite important to know that you have the right number of children at certain points. So they would come up with various proxies, like count the backpacks and then count them against the coats or something like that if they just come in from inside. So yeah, you can work around those kind of tempers. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where to go with that. I do think like I think if we're not calling that collecting data science, and we're just calling it what I'm a little bit hesitant about that because I think so much of what we do, and we don't even necessarily always consider it science. Counting up like last year's March sales figures, like comparing it to this year's and seeing if there's a dip or not. Like that kind of thing is everywhere. And is it just science like? I don't know. I don't know whether it's called science or not, but I mean, if it's sales figures versus last year's, that's pretty good. That's not a proxy. That is what you're actually interested in. Although, you're counting sales figures, and you're not really looking at the profit or the margins necessarily. I think you're always picking which numbers you want to. A good CEO trying to last one more year in front of the board is going to choose the right numbers to highlight, whether that's profit or sales figures or something like that. I'm rambling. I don't really know how to respond to that. Do you want to steer me a little bit more?
No. It's just an interesting little parallel there, and I'd like it's an interesting question of the refusal of data, which could be used for nefarious or positive ends, is itself something that some nations, some groups are very attached to the idea that certain questions should be asked. I think the English are almost distinguished in the world by all data must be gathered. Seems like something that's quite native to our character. Like I said, maybe it has a slight Protestant edge.
Yeah, I think what's most relevant there though is that it's not sovereign. They did not recognize the Canadian government's sovereignty over them, quite rightly. And it was seen as an incursion by a government that had no business being there. That's really the main thing. But it's interesting. There's definitely like a strong Republican spirit. So sort of this idea of the free men of the plain. And
I suppose one of those things is if you are a French government minister, you can admit, yes, there is an intervention that if we had this data, we could do, and it would be good, and it would improve things, and the country would be in a better place if we gathered this data and did this thing, and we're not going to do it because it would be wrong to even ask the question in the first place. And I don't think that could ever happen in England, whereas that happens all the time in France. And it's quite interesting to say, look, I accept that I could do something good with this data. Science could help. This would be progressive. And at the same time, I'm not going to do it because it is effectively taboo.
But so I think there it's also about something a little bit different than data. There's very specific categories that you're not allowed to ask about in France, and it comes from this idea of laïcité, and that if you're French, and that is the extent of your identity. You're not allowed to identify under any other groups, whether it's religion or race. That's true. The problem is, it's a big one, is that this comes from the assumption that everyone is equally French, and that just is not how it plays out in French society at all. So, I think that kind of relates to your question about the branch manager there. I would really like them not to do that, because something has to change about how segregated and unequal along racist lines French society is. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be the Olympic singer debate at the moment. You can see that suddenly.
Sorry?
If you're looking at the Olympic singing debates that's going on at the moment of the French government, like, so many people within French government going, oh, you can't actually have a black person to do the main singing at the Olympics. It's like, suddenly blackness exists when it comes to who sings on a stage, on the world stage, and represents France. So,
I was kind of wondering about it's like some of the dangers of eugenics and we go into those sorts of questions. On the last June, there was someone who Dave Natastu was insistent that the problem with eugenics was that we just hadn't learned how to do it good yet. We were not doing more eugenics until we learned how we could make good eugenics, and the amount of time me and David tried to explain to this person was like, oh my god, shut up, you little Nazi. It was an experience, but like, you know, it's that sort of question where it's kind of is like the thing we shouldn't ever be asking, but is there a world in which this person, like, it was a very British attitude of like, no, we need to do more research, we need to do more learning, like that, and doesn't happen when I was raised Catholic, so yeah, that's an interesting.
I think there's something very scientific in thinking that, and certainly in eugenics, and it's not like that is particularly egregious and easy for us to sort of dismiss example of it, but you see it in like probably on time.
Yeah, we
Okay, I'll carry on with mine. Yeah. So my favorite philosophy podcast is Overthink. They did this episode on fat phobia a couple weeks ago. And I never heard it. I can't remember who the guest was. Maybe somebody will be able to remind me. Anyway, she made clear to me sort of like the positive reason to not just that it harms people, but the sort of the value we're losing when we're fat phobic in society, in a way that hadn't ever been clear to me before. And it's exactly just that. It's like, I mean, I was aware of sort of, I think fat isn't something that is widely misunderstood, even in the medical community. This is kind of a bugbear of mine. And I've thought quite a bit about this. And the problem is that like it's just not known in medical science how to reliably get people to lose weight and keep it off. That just doesn't. It's just not known how to do that. And yet, this is the advice of medical professionals so often, is lose weight. Well, if you can't actually produce that effect, you shouldn't be giving that advice. Makes no sense. So that, like, you could quite reasonably think if we did, then it's sort of like your eugenics family. Acquaintance. If we did know that, then it would be a different story. Then we should do that. And something.
Caveman.
Thank you. It was Caveman. Caveman said, I mean, is that the world we want to live in, where there's a more limited body type up there? And it's like, no, that's like, that I think makes it clear that is just like the wrong place for us to go. Anyway.
Any other questions?
I'm sorry, census, but like, because I know the other day, that everything is company for like Reddit information. When do you think if it was just to deal with purely numbers and figures, it would be truly objective? Really saying the others are as smart as the smartest you. I can't go beyond, but we don't know research and it always comes down. Influence
I don't think so, because it's built into what it is, what measurement is as a tool, is that you have to predetermine what you're looking at for it. So this is sort of, I said in it that like in geometry, it's posited that what you're looking at is the line. You don't discover that the basic characteristic of this, of the distance between this and this is what's sorry?
You still need like the concept of the boundary concept.
Right, and you need to decide that that's what we're talking about, that that's what's relevant here. And things can certainly be objective in the sense that once you have that assumption or that decision built in, that you can get objective measurements. The question is always just like, what is, you're forgetting then that you've made the decision to look for that. That's the non-objective part. And whatever we're doing, just by deciding to use science instead of listen to people and their stories or traditional wisdom or something like that, that's where bias is in that decision. Yeah, it's good point. And it would be really interesting to think, I think, about some of the consequences of AI for this, but yeah, I don't know how.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I was just thinking about the relationship between different kinds of technology and the different forms of knowledge that are made possible, and that, you know, map making requires you to have like paper and some kind of writing technology, right? And I was just wondering how much you thought about the differences between the Egyptian rope used to measure out fields and then the surveyor's chain, both in terms of like how they're produced and what's going on, and then also like what the difference is between measuring something using rope versus the chain.
Yeah. I haven't found, I looked around and tried to find out why they use a chain. I haven't found anything. My assumption is that chains hold their length better than rope, but I don't know if that's true.
Yeah.
I also really like the metaphor, which I was writing about it for like a year before I realized that that was right there. And then they changed the title. Yeah, but I think it's that it holds it. A rope stretches, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it would also be a bit more durable when it's hard to snap a rope or measuring a lot of land.
Maybe that's you measure more land as well,
Yeah.
right? It's precisely because of things like the weight.
Mhm.
Get chewed by a dog.
Yeah, well, because I mean, I was also just wondering about like what's going on in terms of how it's made and thinking about all of the other uses for chains in that period, or like shipping and slavery and things like that. I'm wondering if there's like any connections there.
Mm. I wouldn't,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know about that. Yeah. And I don't know, I'd be really interested to think a little bit about modern surveying tools and what how they compare to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mostly just, it's a pursuit of higher accuracy.
Yeah.
And I think like the important thing is what happens once you, as I said, again, make that decision to measure.
Yeah.
Mhm. But maybe that's because I'm a little bit too idealist and not careless. Yeah.
Let's say thank you once more for a really fascinating talk and discussion as well. Thank you so much. And I think we will be decamping to the terrace bar for a little bit. So you are all warmly invited to join us.
I was shut earlier.
Or was it?
No, it is shut at the moment.
It's not.
Yeah. I would tell anyone just know where it is on Google, but it's now allowed.
That's all right. No, it's great. It's good. Really interesting.
I hope you might enjoy it.
Yes.
relevant thing for some years.
Yeah, I just wait for sure. I'm just not the.
But take it back in mind. But like, it's kind of, it's.
You live in London?
Yeah.
I've heard you say East London.
Yes, that's right.
I'm from King's Cross.
Oh, really? Okay.
Easy box of you as well. I mean, like here.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like Fisher. I mean, you might get with this speech in particular, but I think it's.
I mean, I've done London for a long time.
Science, that's, he's not right accelerationist in the economic sense, but he probably is an accelerationist in the scientific sense.
Enjoy that. Getting on the tube every day, and having someone's arm bit on you. That sort of situation. Are you? Especially within the what have you got across hybrid like here? Thank you.
The high street.
It's university.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that was